throughout the various ages of history, and even well before what is conventionally known as historical times, we find clues of a frequent opposition between the representatives of two powers, one spiritual and one temporal. These were two indivisible aspects of the common principle from which they both proceeded, linked together in a synthesis that was both superior and anterior to their distinction. The Hindu name Hamsa, given to the single primordial caste, indicates spirituality of a very high degree, which, though quite exceptional today, was originally common to all men, and possessed by them as it were spontaneously. This high degree of spirituality lies beyond the four main castes that were subsequently established, and among which the different social functions were distributed. The principle of the institution of the caste, so completely misunderstood by Westerners, is nothing else but the differing natures of human individuals. In effect, each man, by reason of his proper nature, is suited to carry out certain functions to the exclusion of all others, so that each finds his proper place. This, in brief, is the fundamental reason for the existence of the castes, and it is evident that the same principles, albeit with varying modes of application, have presided over the organization of all civilizations possessing a truly traditional character. Just as there are more common characteristics among beings of the same species than those of different species, so also are there more common characteristics among individuals belonging to the same caste than there are between those of different castes. Thus, caste is not in principle strictly hereditary, even though it has frequently become so in fact and in practice. After the primordial men had lost their way, traditional societies divided humanity according to its multiple natures. This led to four main groups, or castes, known to the Indians as the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Sudras. Respectively, these four groups reflected spirituality, action, productivity, and service. Caste distinction, along with the differentiation of the social functions which corresponds to it, results from a break in the primordial unity. Only then do spiritual and temporal power separate. The exercise of these two powers lies in the hands of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, with the spiritual power acting as the superior due to its proximity to the transcendent. Among the ancient Egyptians, one of the meanings of the Sphinx joined precisely these two attributes, viewed according to their normal relationship. In fact, the human head of the Sphinx can be considered as representing wisdom, and its lion body as representing strength. The head is a spiritual authority that directs, and the body is a temporal power which acts. It should be noted, moreover, that the Sphinx is always represented at rest, for the temporal power is taken here in the non-acting state. Elsewhere, we find a verbal symbol that is an exact equivalent of the Sphinx. This is the word druid, which is composed of two parts, dru and vid, the first root signifying strength, and the second root wisdom. Doubtless a memory of the remote epoch when the two powers were still united in their common and supreme principle. In Europe, the distinction between the spiritual and the temporal originated from a division of powers that in ancient Rome were united in a single person, since during that time the imperator was at the same time Pontifex Maximus. The imperator assuming the role as commander-in-chief of the Romans, and Pontifex Maximus assuming the role of a high priest. The Pope and the Emperor were two halves of the Christ Janus, which certain representations depict holding a key in one hand and a scepter in the other, emblems respectively of the priestly and the royal powers united in this figure. The politics of medieval Christianity was, essentially, feudal. It found its consummation in a function that was truly supreme in the temporal order, that of the emperor, who was, with respect to the kings, what the kings were in turn to their vassals. The ideal of the Holy Roman Empire, however, remained never fully realized, no doubt through the fault of the emperors themselves, who, misled by the extent of the power bestowed upon them, were the first to contest their subordination to the spiritual authority. The opposition between the spiritual and temporal powers is found in one form or another among almost all peoples. This is not surprising, since it corresponds to a general law of human history, relating to the cyclical decline of the ages that all societies experience. This opposition of the two powers was depicted among the Celts as a wild boar and a bear locked in combat, a symbolism of Hyperborean origin, and thus connected to one of the most ancient traditions of humanity, the true primordial tradition. As we have said, caste distinction results from a rupture of the primordial unity. Only then do the spiritual and temporal power appear separate from one another. It is only at a late stage of development that this distinction was to be transformed into opposition and rivalry, destroying the original harmony and making way for a struggle between the two powers. It is only in the final age that the subversion of the normal order can occur, and the temporal power can prevail over the spiritual authority. In India, the antagonism between the spiritual and the temporal is found in the form of a rivalry between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. In medieval Europe, it appears especially in the so-called dispute between the priesthood and the empire. It is the mistaking of the relationship of the two powers for one of coordination, whereas it is really one of subordination, because once they are separated, the one proceeds directly from the supreme principle, while the other does so only indirectly. Misunderstanding of this hierarchical order always and everywhere brings about the same consequences: social imbalance, confusion of functions, and domination by progressively more inferior elements.